Coming up on the inaugural broadcast of Rood Radio Podcast, Scott Laird's with me today, and we're going to be talking about what's going on with Shabbat Night Live and everything else that's happening here at A Rood Awakening. And our special guest for today is Dr. Nehemia Gordon from YeHoVaH Foundation, and we're going to talk about everything Nehemia Gordon. You're not going to want to miss a single moment of Rood Radio Podcast. Stay with us. Well, welcome everybody to Rood Radio Podcast. This is our new studios here. We've got our monitor in the background with our great graphics in our new studio here. And of course, my good friend, Dr. Scott Laird. Scott, how are you doing, sir?
Doing great, Ted. How are you doing?
I am fantastic. Well, gosh, it's been so long since we had a podcast and had any kind of radio type program. Before COVID hit, we had Rood Crew Radio, but we didn't do a video side of it. And people kept asking, oh my gosh, Ted, if you would just do a radio version of Rood Crew Radio. So we decided, you know what, Rood Crew Radio, that was the old thing. And now we're going to do Rood Radio, the podcast, where we got video and we have people here from at home and they can actually watch what we're doing instead of just listening to what's going on. So how have you been doing?
Well, very good. When we went home and did, like we said, we just went home and did the what do you call it? The pandemic,
the COVID thing.
The COVID thing.
Yeah.
You wondered if this was ever going to come back, and I'm glad it did. But the podcast, podcasts are really important right now.
Yeah.
Lots of good information coming out there, and sometimes it's the best place to get information.
Sure.
I know I listen to podcasts, every day in the car, that kind of thing. And so we figured this would be a good way to get, more current event type of stuff. Because, we tape things in advance a lot for Shabbat Night Live and things like that. Or as Michael would call it, Shabbat Night Live.
Yeah.
So quite literally.
Yeah.
But, this is a good opportunity just to sit in and say, hey, here's what's coming. Here's what's happening now.
Right.
And we can get this off to you a lot faster than, producing a television show. So.
Yeah. And it's so simple. We have a wonderful lighting director. His name is Terry Bishop. He comes in and he's got all the, and I got my microphone hit. My audio guy now is going to have a fit. But no, he's got all the lights set up and everything is good. And all we have to do is come in and do it and do a podcast. So we're going to come in and we're going to bring special guests as they come in for Shabbat Night Live and sit down and talk with us. And we'll get more intimate about what were they really wanting to say? You know what I'm saying? There's certain things we can talk about on YouTube and certain things we can't talk about because of censorship issues still to this day. And so with Rood Radio Podcast, we have a capability of being able to be a little bit more deep dive on what was being said than they can possibly do on Shabbat Night Live.
And Nehemia is today, right? I think I saw him out in the hallway there.
Yeah, exactly. Dr. Nehemia Gordon, just a great guy, a person that Michael has known for years and years. And of course, I've known him also. But I mean, you're talking about a wealth of knowledge. That's Nehemia Gordon. Nehemia Gordon is probably, Michael would say he is the most scholarly scholar he's ever met. And that is definitely Dr. Nehemia.
Now, you're speaking of Michael. Okay, I was really impressed with Michael. So speaking of recording things ahead of time, so Michael was in here watching what we were doing for Nehemia, and that's coming up in future months.
Right.
But he wanted to be the first to introduce Nehemia for his doctorate.
For his doctorate, yeah. And it was a great day. It was actually symbolic in a way because this was Michael's first interview since his stroke. And he was a little emotional, about it too, because, Nehemia he considers Nehemia to be one of his best friends. And for him to be able to announce to the world Nehemia's doctorate, there's a whole story behind that. And I'll get Nehemia to tell us that story here in just a little bit. But it was just really great to see him back in the chair again.
It was.
And in doing what he does best, which is getting the truth out and getting the truth of the Bible out and so forth. So, and that's what I love about Nehemia as well, is because he is so skilled and so knowledgeable on the Bible. I can sit there for hours and listen to him tell us the truth about what the Bible really says. And that's the real issue when it comes to Bible interpretation. You've got this guy that interprets the Bible this way and this guy that interprets the Bible this way. Well, Nehemia comes from the roots of the Bible. He doesn't believe necessarily in interpretation. He goes and he proves things by finding different codexes, different books of the Bible, different Bible things. And it's just so wonderful to know that this is not hearsay that we're hearing from Nehemia. This is truth. This is fact. Mm-hmm. And that's what I love when I talk to Nehemia, and when we see him with you on Shabbat Night Live, it's just fabulous.
It's a perfect combo for Michael too, because Michael wants to get away from the Takanot and then Ma'asim of the Pharisees, right? Well, we have just as much of that today in the Jewish world, but also in the Christian world.
Absolutely,
everybody's making up their own rules and that kind of thing. And Michael's like, no, what did Messiah say? What did Yeshua say?
Yeah,
and Nehemia is that way too, because he's a Karaite Jew, and if people don't know what that is, well, the Karaite Jew just goes by the Torah.
Right.
I don't care about these other books.
Right.
What did God say? What did his prophets say?
Yes.
Let's take a look at that and let that be our guide. Never mind like you said, the interpretation, because each of us has, opinions are like a belly button, right? Everybody's got one. So it's, it doesn't make any sense to me. Well, I listen to this guy, I listen to that guy. Well, why are we listening to man? Why don't we listen to what God says? And so I really love when Nehemia comes in, and I think those who are smart really appreciate that, because Nehemia is a Jew.
Absolutely.
He is not a believer, but he knows a heck of a lot more about the New Testament than most believers do.
Yes, absolutely.
So I have to respect him for that.
Yeah, I agree. Now, let's talk a little bit about Shabbat Night Live. What's coming up in January on Shabbat Night Live, and what are we talking about on the main show?
So on January 6th, we have Paul Shea, who's the head of Kingdom for Jesus, and it's sort of an arm, sort of unofficial arm of a Rood Awakening. Yeah. And they handle all of our Chinese stuff. And this is how Michael went to Taiwan and preached to the folks there through a guy named Paul Shea.
Yes, and by the way, you're talking about an oppressed people. Mm-hmm. We don't see that. You see what you see on mainstream media. You see all the news about what's going on with China and stuff like that, but you never hear about the oppressed Christians that are in China and how bad it really is. So that's going to be a great show.
Well, Paul
for people to watch.
And he brought up this interesting thing where he said that the more people are oppressed, it's sort of like a seesaw. Mm-hmm. So the more people are oppressed, the more their faith comes up on the other end. And the more they're oppressed, the more they feel empowered and unstoppable. And God just opens the doors for them and woof, they go.
Yes.
And he said something really interesting you'll hear is that Taiwan is actually the key. We hear a lot about big old China picking on Taiwan militarily and politically and that kind of thing. But Paul said that for the faith of the world, for the faith of Christians in China, Taiwan is what he called the steering wheel for the Chinese world.
Wow.
So Taiwan is even more important religiously than it even is for politically and everything else. It's got a real key to everything happening over there.
Well, I know we've got more stuff coming up on SNL this month, but listen, we're running out of time on this segment, and I just can't wait to get Dr. Nehemia Gordon in here and talk to him and find out the real scoop on Dr. Gordon. So folks, don't go anywhere. We'll be right back with more Rood Radio podcast in just a moment with our special guest, Dr. Nehemia Gordon. Don't go anywhere.
What made Yeshua different from the rabbis of his time? Why did everyone run to see him wherever he went? And what was it that made his message so radical?
Yeshua sits down among a crowd, like any teacher should do, and he begins a powerful message that spans several chapters, and it's radical, and it's messy, and it's hard.
The Radical Rabbi with Pastor Matthew Vander Els is our gift to thank you for supporting A Rood Awakening International. When you donate $50 to this ministry in February, we'll send you The Radical Rabbi with Matthew Vander Els on DVD or Blu-ray. Donate $100 and we'll send you the teaching plus the Faith and Generosity box set, featuring a solid wood pen, a journal, and a coffee mug featuring the story of the widow's mite. Donate $300 and we'll send you the teaching, the Faith and Generosity box set, plus a pair of authentic Jerusalem stone candle holders. Offer ends February 28th. Call the number on your screen or get your gifts online at monthlylovegift.com.
Well, welcome back to the second segment of Rood Radio Podcast. I am so unbelievably excited to have as my first guest on the Rood Radio podcast after Scott Laird, Dr. Nehemia Gordon. Doctor, thank you for being with us.
Hey, thanks, Ted. It's great to be here.
Well, Nehemia, listen, I tell you, we've known each other for several years now, and you've known Michael way longer.
Yeah, over 20 years.
Yeah, over 20 years. So I'm going to ask you some questions today that are maybe what people don't get to see on television sometime when you're doing all your stuff. First of all, I want to tell you thank you for all of the knowledge that you bring to the table for all of us to understand the Bible. In our first segment, I was talking to Scott earlier, and I said, you know, there are a lot of people that talk about the Bible, okay? But I really believe Nehemia Gordon knows the Bible. And because of that, I want to get some information from you. I'd like to go back to the beginning of all of this. I want to go back to where Nehemia Gordon really, now, of course, you're from Israel.
No, I was actually born and raised in Chicago.
Okay, well, there's the first fact right there.
On the north side.
There's the first fact right there. Most people think that you were born in Israel.
No, I lived in Israel for 20 years. I was born and raised in Chicago, moved there when I was 20.
So what in the world? Okay, so now you're a young Nehemia Gordon.
Yeah.
You know, what made you gravitate toward knowing more about the Bible?
So, Ted, I was raised really in an ultra-Orthodox Jewish educational system. Mm-hmm. My father was a lawyer, but also a rabbi. And
wow.
So sitting on his knee when I was 3 years old, he started to teach me about the Torah and about the Torah, meaning the 5 books of Moses and the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, but also the teachings of the rabbis. And some of my earliest memories are a debate between 2 rabbis about how old Abraham was when he came to know God. And it wasn't even just what the answer was. It was this one rabbi said he was 40 and the other rabbi said he was 3. And
3?
That's one of the rabbinical opinions.
Wow.
And so from the earliest age, it wasn't just what does the Bible say, it is what did the rabbis say about the Bible? Mm-hmm. And I was taught really at a very young age that when 2 rabbis disagree, they're both the words of the living God. And I said, this doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah.
When there's 2, either he was 3 or he was 40, or maybe he was 14. I have no idea. But there's only one truth, and there can be only one truth. And I'd like to know what that is. And I don't want to be bound by what some rabbi says it is. And I went and I expressed this opinion to my teachers, and I was told, you mustn't say that. That's heresy, the heresy of the Karaite Jews. And I said, okay, I guess I'm a Karaite Jew then. And I was told, no, you can't be a Karaite Jew. You'll cease to exist. It's a dead end being a Karaite Jew. And I said, I don't care if I'm the only one. I want to follow the truth, even if I'm the only one who does it. And I was ridiculed for this and mocked for this, but I said, I don't care. I've got to follow the truth.
Sure. Well, okay, let me stop you there for just a moment. So Orthodox Jews, Karaite Jews.
Yeah.
What is a Karaite Jew?
So Orthodox Judaism is a continuation of the ancient Pharisees.
Okay.
And the most basic doctrine of the Orthodox that I was taught growing up is that Moses received 2 separate revelations on Mount Sinai, the written Torah, the 5 books of Moses, and the oral Torah. Okay. And the way I've heard it described is that the written Torah is like if you're listening to a lecture and you're taking notes, that's the written Torah. The actual contents of the lecture, that's the oral Torah. So if you open up the 5 books of Moses, you would never know what to do unless you consulted the oral Torah to see what it says that the actual contents of the revelation were.
Gotcha.
And the oral Torah in reality is just the teachings of different rabbis. And I said, this isn't the word of God.
Yeah.
This is this rabbi saying one thing and another rabbi saying another thing and disagreeing. And they might all be wrong. They certainly can't all be right. There can only be one truth.
Yeah.
And that was considered heresy. That was scripturalism. Being a follower only of the Bible. And the ancient Hebrew word for Bible was kara.
Gotcha.
So Karaite were the Jews who only followed the Bible, in contrast to the Talmudites or the Rabbinites, who were Jews who followed the Talmud or the rabbis in the Talmud.
Gotcha.
And I realized I was a Karaite Jew before I actually knew there were other Karaite Jews in the world. As far as I knew, I was the only one, and it didn't matter. Look, I want to tell you the real secret.
Okay, so it wasn't like there's this whole synagogue of Karaite Jews necessarily.
Well, there are, but I didn't know those existed at the time. There weren't any in Chicago.
Oh, okay.
It was years before I met another Karaite, literally years. But I want to tell you the secret behind my personality here. And I didn't understand this until I was around 40 years old, Ted. And that's that there's this thing called Asperger's. I don't know if you've ever heard about that.
Absolutely, yeah.
Well, I discovered around 40 years old that I had that. And my whole life...
You have Asperger's.
Yeah, and my whole life suddenly made sense. People with Asperger's often become obsessed about a specific topic.
Yeah.
And I had a topic, Ted, and it wasn't the Bible. It was Doctor Who. When I was a little kid, I could recite the name and plot of every episode of Doctor Who going back to when it was founded in the early 1960s.
Oh, man.
And at a certain point in my life, I had what today I would call an existential crisis. And I realized life has to be more about, there has to be more to life than Doctor Who. It has to be more about than that. And I decided the only thing that was really important in life, and this is before I read Ecclesiastes, the only thing that was really important in life was to serve God. And I better figure out what it is that God actually wants from us.
You bet.
And I knew even at that point in my life, it wasn't a bunch of teachings of what the rabbis say. Those were interesting and I could learn things from them. But ultimately I had to see, what does God actually have in store for us? What does he reveal in his word? And for me, his word was the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible.
Yeah.
And I shifted in a very conscious way, without understanding Asperger's, my obsession with Doctor Who to the Bible. And I decided to spend every waking moment breathing, eating, living the Bible. And that's what I've been doing ever since.
Wow. Let me tell you, ladies and gentlemen, this has already been an exceptional segment here. So we're going to learn more about Dr. Gordon in just a moment. So break out your police boxes and we'll be right back in just a moment. You're listening and watching the Rood Radio Podcast. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. Well, welcome back to Rood Radio Podcast, ladies and gentlemen. We are having a great discussion with my good friend, Dr. Nehemia Gordon. He's the executive director of Maycor Hebrew Foundation. And Dr. Gordon... Doctor Who. I mean, that was just fabulous. I love hearing that. But let me move us a little bit more forward in time now. And let's talk about the time where you actually met Michael Rood. Tell me about how you met with Michael and got to know Michael and how it changed your life.
Well, you know, Ted, I had actually moved to Israel, and ended up meeting Michael in Israel. And met all kinds of interesting people. What brought me to Israel was I grew up being told my whole youth that I came from a long line of rabbis. And when I expressed my Karaite beliefs, I was told, who do you think you are? Do you think you know more than your great-grandfather, this great rabbi, and this other ancestor, your ancestor, this great rabbi, and this whole line of great rabbis? I was told I was descended from Rashi, this great rabbi. And how can you come against all of these great rabbis going back over 1,000 years? Who do you think you are? Do you think you know as much as them? And I decided I needed to. I needed to know as much as they did, and perhaps more if I could. And that led me to move to Israel, become fluent in Hebrew. and eventually studied at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. I did my BA there, my bachelor's degree in biblical studies and archaeology. I did a double major, and then my master's in biblical studies. And then eventually I did my doctorate at Bar-Ilan University in biblical studies. And when I met Michael, I was still at that point, I'd finished my bachelor's degree. I was working on my master's degree, and I had all kinds of people who would come to meet with me because they knew I was the Karaite Jew in Jerusalem. And they would, but actually, Michael actually came to me to talk to me about the calendar, because that was one of the things that I decided to focus on. Well, I didn't really have a choice from my perspective. And that was that we were following a man-made calendar. And people said, well, but someone has to come and restore the calendar. And I said, why do we have to wait for someone? Why can't we just do it?
Yeah.
And so I spent years, 20 years, working on the calendar, going out, sighting new moons, looking for what's called the Aviv barley. And it was in that connection that Michael came and interacted with me. And I have to say, I didn't have a very high view of Jesus or Yeshua.
Yeah.
And Michael had what I saw was a refreshing perspective on Yeshua. A lot of times Yeshua was presented as, well, he was a Jewish rabbi. Well, I don't follow rabbis. I follow the word of God, which to me is the Tanakh.
Yeah.
So
exactly.
I don't need another rabbi. I've got thousands of rabbis whose works I can study.
Yeah.
Why am I interested in one more rabbi?
That's right.
And as I looked at the New Testament, and look, I'm not a Christian. I'm a Karaite Jew.
Sure. No, understood.
Old Testament, that's my scripture.
Yeah.
But as I looked at the New Testament, understanding some of the things there where Yeshua was opposing the rabbis, in some of the very ways that I opposed the rabbis, I actually identified with a lot of the things he was teaching.
Right.
And Michael was one of the first people I encountered who brought that perspective and said, well, okay, he might have been a rabbi, but he wasn't upholding the man-made traditions of the rabbis.
Right.
A lot of Messianic Judaism is really it's rabbinical Judaism light.
Yeah.
Right? It's kind of Reformed Judaism with Jesus.
Sure.
That's really what it is in many respects.
Exactly.
It's, chicken soup and knedlach and various Jewish traditions mixed in there with Jesus. And, that had no appeal for me whatsoever. That was a Jesus who was just upholding the oral law. The oral law I knew to be false.
Yeah.
But when I actually looked at what he said, I didn't see that. I saw him calling into question the traditions of men and contrasting that with the law of God. And I'm like, hey, wait a minute. He sounds like a Karaite to me. And I'm not saying Yeshua was a Karaite, but there's definitely a Karaite aspect in the sense that he opposed the man-made traditions of the Pharisees. And I identified with that a lot.
We've got about 3 minutes left in this segment. I want you to talk to me a little bit about what are you going to be doing in the future? I know you've done a lot of research studies at the Vatican and stuff. Tell me a little bit about what you've done. Like I said, we've only got about 3 minutes left, but tell me about what you've done in the Vatican and tell me what you plan to do in the future. I know there was a lot of electronics involved in all of that.
Yeah, so I'm working with some people in Europe who are using something called X-ray fluorescence. It's a state-of-the-art technology to look at the inks. As I'm looking at Bible manuscripts, I'm seeing that there were changes made, and we can actually distinguish between the different hands, between the original scribe and the later scribe. Up until now, that was basically guesswork, and now we can use these scientific techniques to actually see, these are two different inks, and it's really incredible stuff. In the Vatican,
you mean two different inks? You mean that two different set of people were actually working on the same?
Absolutely.
Were they working at the same time or at different
in some
time?
instances, we found they were working at the same time. In other instances, it was centuries later. And when you looked at the manuscript, you'd say, okay, there's, all these different words and symbols, and they're all they're part of the manuscript. But now we can look at them and say, no, that was added centuries later, and that actually has nothing to do with the original manuscript.
Gotcha.
I actually worked on a research project that Michael inspired me to do. It was a question he had about John 6:4. There's a whole teaching we've done on that. And when I was doing that, I worked on a lot of New Testament manuscripts, and I was very impressed with what New Testament scholars had done with their manuscripts. And I said, we need that for the Tanakh, for the Old Testament.
Gotcha.
You can take any verse and look it up and almost instantly see it in over 2,000 New Testament manuscripts. we have those manuscripts for the Tanakh, for the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, but they haven't been properly indexed and digitized and set up in a way. And that's one of my objectives. After I did that John 6:4 research, I decided I need to do for the Old Testament, for the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, what scholars have been working on for over 100 years to do for the New Testament, and make the Bible available in the original manuscripts to anybody who wants to look at them and see them. You shouldn't have to have a PhD in biblical studies from Israeli University to get access to the Word of God, to these manuscripts. So one of my goals in life now, one of my new obsession is to make these manuscripts available, and that's what I'm working on.
Well, listen, Nehemia, don't go anywhere. We're going to do one more short segment when we come back. But listen, we're so honored to have you here with us. Dr. Nehemia Gordon is with us today, folks. He's the executive director of Makor Hebrew Foundation. And we will be right back with our last segment on Rood Radio Podcast in just a moment. Don't go anywhere. Well, welcome back to Rood Radio Podcast. Ladies and gentlemen, I am here, blessed to be here with Dr. Nehemia Gordon. So, Nehemia, I know you have 1,000 other things we could talk about, and we're going to have you back on Rood Radio Podcast again next time you're in town.
Sounds good.
And talk more and more about everything you're doing. We hadn't even touched the subject of the codexes that you've seen and the name and how many times. So there's so much more to talk about. But ladies and gentlemen, you can get the information now because you can drop by Nehemia's website. So Nehemia, tell me, where is your website?
So my main website is nehemiahswall.com. I'm Nehemia, and I built the wall.
Okay.
nehemiahswall.com, and people can call 800-420-8206. We've got people answer the phone. And we've got all kinds of teaching, hundreds of hours of audio and video. I also have the Institute for Hebrew Bible Manuscript Research. That's ihbmr.com.
Okay.
And that's a new research institute I've launched where we're doing a collaboration with Oxford University and all kinds of other high institutions of learning. And the goal is to make these manuscripts available to the world. Like I said, you shouldn't need a PhD from an Israeli university to access the Bible.
Yeah.
Anybody should have access to it at their fingertips to be able to pull these things up and see them and make them searchable. That's my goal, to bring the Bible to the people. And, you know, back in the day, it was a lifetime of work just to access one or two manuscripts. And we have the technology and ability today to make all the Hebrew manuscripts of the Bible and Greek manuscripts available at people's fingertips.
Well, Nehemia, like I said, we could talk literally for hours sitting here talking about the Bible and everything about it. But ladies and gentlemen, once again, Dr. Nehemia Gordon, Executive Director of Makor Hebrew Foundation. Thank you again, Nehemia, for being here with us. We greatly appreciate it. So that's it, ladies and gentlemen. It's our inaugural broadcast here on Rood Radio Podcast. We just love having you here with us. We love you being able to be in here and see what we're doing as we're doing it here. So for my audio producer, Kenneth Collins, and the entire Rood Crew staff, we wish you peace and shalom and wish you well. Take care of yourself. Bye now. See you next month.